You're looking at a $3 bottle sitting on a grocery store shelf right now. It's wedged between the ketchup and the barbecue sauce. Most people grab it, slap it on a rack of ribs, and never think twice about it. But what if I told you that this exact bottle, this $3 bottle of liquid smoke, contains the precise chemical signal that nature has used for 60 million years to wake the dead? Because that's what we're talking about today. Seeds that won't germinate, seeds that have been sitting in soil for months, soaking in water for weeks, refusing to crack open no matter what you do. You've probably been there. You follow the instructions on the packet, you do everything right, and still nothing. So you go back to the store, you buy more seeds, maybe you buy one of those $20 seed starter kits with the fancy label and the scientific sounding claims. And the cycle repeats. Here's what nobody in that $47 billion seed industry will ever put on a label. Those stubborn seeds aren't broken. They're waiting. They are biologically programmed to wait for one specific signal, a signal that has nothing to do with water, nothing to do with sunlight, and nothing to do with any product on that shelf. They're waiting for fire. And in 2004, a group of scientists at the University of Western Australia published a paper in Science, one of the most respected journals on the planet, that proved exactly how that signal works at the molecular level. That paper has been cited over 1,500 times in academic literature, but in 20 years, not a single gardening channel has ever talked about it, until today. To understand why a $3 bottle of barbecue flavoring can hijack the germination process of a seed, you first need to go back, not 10 years, not 100, but 60 million years to a time when fire wasn't a disaster. It was a calendar. In the vast dry landscapes of Australia, South Africa, in the Mediterranean basin, plants didn't evolve despite fire. They evolved with it. Seasonal wildfires swept through these regions with the kind of clockwork regularity that made them, paradoxically, one of the most predictable forces in nature. And over millions of years, certain plant species made a radical evolutionary bet. They would refuse to germinate until the fire came. Think about the logic for a moment. Right after a wildfire passes through, the landscape looks like a wasteland. But for a seed, it's the opposite of death. It's the perfect opportunity. The competing vegetation is gone. The thick canopy that blocks sunlight has been stripped away. The ash left behind is rich in potassium, calcium, and phosphorus. A flush of nutrients dumped directly into the topsoil. Predators and insects that would normally feast on fresh seedlings have fled or perished. For a seed waking up in the weeks after a fire, it's not entering a burned world. It's entering the most resource-rich, competition-free window of opportunity in decades. So these plants evolved a biological lock so sophisticated it took modern molecular science until 2004 to crack it open. The seeds would sit dormant, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, completely impervious to rain, warmth, and soil contact. They were holding out for one thing and one thing only, the chemical signature of smoke. But here's what makes this story even deeper than plant biology. Humans figured this out first. Long before any laboratory existed in Australia, the Aboriginal peoples of that continent had developed a land management practice that Western science would spend 2 centuries misunderstanding and suppressing. They called it cultural burning, a sophisticated, carefully timed system of low-intensity fires that had been refined over at least 50,000 years. They burned in patterns. They burned in seasons. They burned with an understanding of how fire moved through different vegetation, what it left behind, and what it awakened. The results were extraordinary. Country managed through cultural burning was more biodiverse, more productive, and more resilient than anything European settlers had ever seen. Early colonial botanists documented explosions of native wildflowers and grasses appearing in the weeks after these burns. Growth so dense and sudden it seemed almost impossible. They recorded it, wondered at it, and then, when colonial governments began banning Aboriginal burning practices throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, they watched it slowly disappear. The knowledge wasn't lost because it was wrong. It was lost because the people who held it were stripped of the right to practice it. And with that loss, an entire category of plants, species that had co-evolved with human-managed fire for thousands of generations, began their quiet decline toward extinction. The seeds were still there, buried in the soil, still carrying their ancient instructions, still waiting for a signal that no longer came. What those seeds were waiting for, what that signal actually was at the chemical level, would remain a mystery for another 200 years. Perth, Australia, 1990s. A team of botanists and ecologists is staring at a problem they cannot explain. After every major wildfire that tears through the Australian bush, something extraordinary happens in the weeks that follow. The scorched earth, which by all appearances should be sterile and lifeless, erupts. Native species that hadn't been seen in those areas for decades suddenly reappear. Seeds that had been lying dormant in the soil, some of them for 20, 30 years, crack open simultaneously as if someone had flipped a switch. The density of germination after these fires is so far beyond anything that occurs in normal seasons that the research team knows, with certainty, that something specific is triggering it. The question is what? The first hypothesis is heat. Maybe the intense temperature of the fire is cracking open the hard seed coats, allowing water to penetrate for the first time. It's a reasonable guess, and it's wrong. When researchers apply controlled heat to the same seeds in a laboratory setting, germination rates barely move. Heat alone explains almost nothing. The second hypothesis is ash. The massive influx of mineral-rich ash changes the soil chemistry dramatically after a fire. Maybe the sudden shift in pH or the flood of potassium and phosphorus is what's waking the seeds up. They test this too. They saturate soil samples with wood ash, adjust the chemistry to match post-fire conditions precisely. Again, almost no effect. The seeds sit there, indifferent. The third hypothesis is light. With the canopy gone, the seeds are suddenly exposed to full-spectrum sunlight for the first time in years. Some seeds are known to respond to light signals. But the timing doesn't hold up. Many of the strongest germination responses happen in species buried too deep in the soil to detect any light signal at all. One by one, the obvious explanations are ruled out, and what's left, the thing the team keeps circling back to, almost reluctantly, is smoke itself. It seems almost too simple, too folkloric. Smoke is not a nutrient, it's not a physical force, it's a gas, a complex, chaotic mixture of hundreds of different compounds produced by incomplete combustion. The idea that seeds could somehow detect smoke, could read it as a specific biological signal and respond to it with such precision, runs against the grain of how most scientists at the time think about germination. Seeds respond to concrete physical conditions, moisture, temperature, light, not to something as ephemeral as the smell of a fire. But the data keeps pointing there. In a series of experiments that would have seemed almost absurd to describe in a grant proposal, the team begins exposing seeds to smoke. Not heat, not ash, not altered soil chemistry, just smoke. They bubble smoke through water to create what they call smoke water. They expose petri dishes of native Australian seeds to this solution. And for species after species after species, the germination rates explode. Some species that had shown near zero germination under every other condition suddenly achieve germination rates above 80%. The mechanism is real. Smoke is doing something that nothing else can replicate. But for nearly a decade, the research team still doesn't know what in the smoke is responsible. Smoke water works, but smoke is a mixture of thousands of compounds. Which one is the key? That answer comes in 2004. Gavin Flamati, a chemist at the University of Western Australia, takes on the painstaking work of isolating and identifying the active compound. It takes years of fractional distillation, bioassay-guided separation, and systematic elimination. He is, in essence, searching for a single specific molecule inside an extraordinarily complex chemical soup. And when he finally finds it, when he isolates the compound, determines its structure, and tests it alone against dormant seeds, it works. Perfectly. A tiny butanylide molecule, present in smoke in minuscule concentrations, is solely responsible for one of the most dramatic germination responses in the plant kingdom. He names the compound carrageenolide. The broader family it belongs to becomes known as carrageenans, from carrick, the word for smoke in the Noongar language of the Aboriginal peoples of southwestern Australia. A small but deliberate acknowledgement that this knowledge, in practice, had existed for 50,000 years before any laboratory confirmed it. The paper is published in Science in 2004. It is immediately recognized as a landmark discovery. Within a decade, the molecular receptor that kerikins bind to inside plant cells, a protein called KAI2, is fully mapped. The downstream genetic cascade is documented. The entire mechanism, from the moment a keratin molecule contacts a seed coat to the moment the first root tip emerges, is laid out in precise molecular detail. 1,500 academic citations, coverage in botanical journals across 6 continents, a discovery that reframes how biologists understand the relationship between fire ecosystems and plant evolution. And in the gardening world, the world of the people who actually grow things, who actually struggle with stubborn seeds and failed germination, complete silence. Not because the information was hidden, not because anyone classified it or buried it, but because there is an entire industry, a $47 billion industry, that profits enormously from you not connecting these dots yourself. That industry knew exactly what kerikins meant the moment Flimati's paper dropped. And what they did next is the part of this story that should make you angry. Before we talk about what that industry did with Flimati's discovery, you need to understand exactly what kerikins do inside a seed. Because once you understand the mechanism, you will never look at a packet of professional seed treatment the same way again. A seed in dormancy is not simply a seed that hasn't gotten enough water or warmth. It is a seed that is actively, biochemically refusing to germinate. There is a molecule inside it called abscisic acid, ABA for short, and its entire function is to keep the seed locked down. ABA is essentially the seed's internal alarm system. It suppresses metabolism, blocks cell division, and maintains the embryo in a state of suspended animation that can last years, sometimes decades. The seed isn't waiting for conditions to improve. It is actively preventing itself from responding to conditions, no matter how ideal they become. Rain doesn't matter. Warmth doesn't matter. You can soak that seed for a month in perfect water at perfect temperature, and ABA will hold the lock in place. This is the biological reality behind every stubborn seed you've ever tried to germinate and failed. You weren't doing anything wrong. You were simply missing the one signal that evolution designed to override that lock. Now here is where kerikins enter, and where the science becomes almost cinematic in its elegance. When a keratin molecule, one of the butanylide compounds released during the combustion of cellulose, comes into contact with a seed, it doesn't force the seed open through any physical mechanism. It doesn't crack the seed coat. It doesn't flood the embryo with water. What it does is far more sophisticated. It binds to a specific protein receptor inside the seed called KAI2. And KAI2, when activated, triggers a cascade of genetic responses that simultaneously does 2 things. It activates the genes responsible for producing gibberellin, the growth hormone that initiates cell elongation, root emergence, and shoot development. And it suppresses the production of ABA. It doesn't just add an accelerator, it removes the brake at the same time. Think of it this way. For decades, scientists and gardeners alike have been trying to start a car with a dead engine by pouring fuel into the tank. More water, more nutrients, better soil. All of it is fuel for a process that the seed is not yet allowing to begin. Kerikins don't add more fuel. Kerikins reach into the ignition system, turn the key, and release the handbrake simultaneously. The engine was always there. The fuel was always there. The seed simply needed the one signal it was genetically programmed to trust. And that signal, for 60 million years, was the chemical fingerprint of fire. Now, here is the part that matters for anyone watching this with a packet of seeds and a bag of potting mix. Pure kerikinolide, the isolated compound, is extraordinarily effective. Research trials have demonstrated germination rate improvements of 50% to over 400% in keratin-responsive species compared to untreated controls. But pure kerikinolide is not something you can buy at a grocery store. It is a laboratory compound synthesized for research purposes, and accessing it as a home gardener is essentially impossible. However, kerikins are not unique to laboratory synthesis. They are produced anytime cellulose burns, Anytime organic plant material undergoes incomplete combustion, Kerrikins form in the smoke, and one of the most concentrated, accessible, and affordable sources of condensed wood smoke available to any person on Earth right now is sitting in the condiment aisle of your local supermarket for $2.99. Liquid smoke is made through a remarkably straightforward industrial process. Wood, typically hickory, mesquite, or applewood, is burned in a controlled chamber. The smoke is passed through cold water, and the water-soluble compounds in the smoke are captured in solution. That solution is then filtered, concentrated, and bottled. What you are buying when you buy a bottle of liquid smoke is, chemically speaking, a condensed aqueous solution of wood combustion byproducts, including, unavoidably, kerrikins and their chemical relatives. It is not a perfect substitute for purified carrageenolide. The concentration of kerrikins in liquid smoke varies by brand, wood source, and production method, and it contains many other compounds alongside them. Some of those compounds in high concentrations can actually inhibit germination rather than stimulate it, which is why the dilution ratio matters enormously. Research published in the Seed Science Research Journal and subsequent horticultural trials suggests that the effective working range for smoke water solutions falls between roughly 1 part smoke water per 500 parts water to 1 part per 1,000 parts water. Too concentrated, the inhibitory compounds begin to outweigh the kerrikin signal. Too dilute, and the kerrikin concentration drops below the threshold needed to activate Ki2 receptors effectively. For liquid smoke specifically, which is already a concentrated solution rather than raw smoke water, the equivalent working dilution translates to approximately 3 to 5 drops per 250 milliliters of water. That ratio keeps the kerrikin signal strong enough to trigger the Ki2 receptor cascade while staying below the concentration at which other smoke compounds begin working against you. It is worth being honest about the limits here, because this is not a universal solution, and pretending otherwise would undermine everything. Kerrikin sensitivity is not present in all plant species. It evolves specifically in plants from fire-adapted ecosystems, Australian natives, South African finbaw species, Mediterranean wildflowers, certain prairie grasses, and native herbs. Vegetables and fruits bred through thousands of years of agricultural selection. Your tomatoes, your peppers, your cucumbers do not carry functional Ki2 receptors tuned to kerrikin signals in the same way. Treating standard vegetable seeds with liquid smoke solution will likely do very little and potentially cause mild inhibition at higher concentrations. But for anyone working with native wildflowers, heritage herb varieties, hard-coated woodland seeds, or any species that has historically been frustratingly difficult to germinate, this is not a marginal improvement. Trials with kerrikin-treated grevillea seeds have shown germination rates jumping from under 10% to above 70%. Protea species that typically require weeks of cold stratification and still produce erratic results have shown synchronized germination within 5 to 7 days of kerrikin treatment. Certain Mediterranean wildflower species that gardeners routinely give up on have shown germination responses that, without understanding the underlying science, look almost like magic. It is not magic. It is 60 million years of molecular engineering sitting in a bottle on a supermarket shelf waiting for someone to read the right paper. The $47 billion seed industry read that paper 20 years ago. They understood immediately what it meant. And the response of that industry to Flemati's discovery is one of the most quietly instructive stories in modern agricultural history. Because they didn't suppress the science. They did something far more effective than suppression. They packaged it, patented it, and sold it back to you at 50 times the cost. Let's talk about the number $47 billion. That is the current annual valuation of the global seed market as of 2023. Not the fertilizer market, not the pesticide market, not the broader agricultural inputs industry, just seeds. And that number is projected to reach $77 billion by 2030, growing at a compound annual rate that outpaces most sectors of the global economy. Within that market, there is a specific subcategory that has been quietly exploding since the mid-2000s, right around the time Flemati's paper landed in Science. It's called the seed enhancement market. Seed priming, seed coating, seed treatment. The professional application of biological and chemical signals to seeds before they reach the consumer in order to improve germination rates, uniformity, and vigor. That market alone was valued at $1.2 billion in 2022, growing at approximately 8% per year. You are now in a position to understand exactly what is being sold in that $1.2 billion market. And you are in a position to understand why it has been growing so fast since 2004. Within months of Flamati's publication, patent applications began appearing, not from universities, not from botanical research institutions, from agricultural corporations. The process of treating seeds with smoke-derived compounds to enhance germination, the precise mechanism that Aboriginal Australians had practiced for 50,000 years, that Flamati's team had spent a decade isolating and documenting, was being filed as proprietary intellectual property by companies that had contributed nothing to its discovery. By the early 2010s, smoke water treatment protocols had been folded into the professional seed enhancement pipelines of several major agricultural input companies. The knowledge moved from a freely published academic paper into a commercialized process, repackaged with professional branding, clinical-looking labels, and price points calibrated for institutional buyers. Products built on Karakin-adjacent science now appear across the horticultural supply chain under names that communicate nothing about their underlying mechanism. Germination accelerators, seed vigor enhancers, pre-treatment solutions, a 100 milliliter bottle of smoke water concentrate, a product whose active compounds can be derived from the same $3 bottle of liquid smoke sitting in your kitchen, retails in professional horticultural catalogs for between $18 and $28. The markup is not covering research costs. Flamati's research was publicly funded and freely published. The markup is covering marketing, packaging, and the cost of your not knowing that the active ingredient has a grocery store equivalent. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. Nobody held a secret meeting and decided to hide Karakins from home gardeners. What happened is more mundane and in many ways more troubling than outright suppression. A piece of publicly available scientific knowledge simply never traveled from the academic world into the practical world, because the commercial incentive to translate it ran entirely in the opposite direction. The companies that read that paper in 2004 had every financial reason to turn it into a product, and no financial reason whatsoever to turn it into public knowledge. So they did one and not the other. And for 20 years, the gap between what is known and what is practiced has been generating $1.2 billion in annual revenue. Here is the comparison that should sit with you. A bottle of Yates Seed Booster, one of the more widely available commercial seed treatment products in the horticultural market, retails for approximately $22 for 100 milliliters. The recommended application rate produces roughly 50 to 60 individual seed treatments per bottle. That works out to between 35 and 44 cents per seed treatment. A bottle of Colgan Natural Liquid Smoke costs $2.99 and contains approximately 148 milliliters. At the working dilution of 4 drops per 250 milliliters of water, that bottle contains somewhere in the range of 500 to 600 individual seed treatments. That works out to approximately half a cent per treatment, the same underlying biochemical signal, a price difference of roughly 70 to 80 times. Now here is the sentence that this video has been building toward, and I want you to hear it clearly. You are not a customer of the seed industry. You are the heir to 60 million years of plant evolution and 50,000 years of human agricultural knowledge. Knowledge that existed long before any corporation thought to charge for it, and knowledge that no patent filing can remove from the physical world. The Karakin receptor in that seed does not know what brand of solution it's responding to. It does not know whether the smoke compounds reaching it came from a $28 professional concentrate or a $3 bottle from the condiment aisle. The molecular key fits the molecular lock regardless of the price paid for the key. What the industry has sold you for 20 years is the lock and the key together when you already had the key. You just didn't know what door it opened. That changes right now. So let's open the door. Everything you need for this is either already in your kitchen or available at any supermarket for under $5. There is no special equipment. There is no technique that requires prior experience. What there is, and this matters, is precision. because the difference between a Caracan solution that triggers an 80% germination rate and one that actively inhibits germination is almost entirely a question of concentration. Get the ratio right, and you are working with 60 million years of evolutionary engineering. Get it wrong in the direction of too much, and you are essentially poisoning the signal with noise. So we are going to go through this carefully. The first thing you need is the right liquid smoke. This is not negotiable. Liquid smoke products vary significantly in composition, and the variation that matters most for this application is the presence of salt and artificial additives. Many flavored liquid smoke products, particularly those marketed as hickory blend or mesquite seasoning, contain sodium, vinegar, caramel color, and flavor enhancers that have no place near a germinating seed. Salt in particular is actively harmful to seedling development at the concentrations found in flavored products. What you are looking for is a label that says nothing except wood smoke and water. In the United States, Colgan Natural Liquid Smoke and writes all. Natural liquid smoke both meet this standard. In other markets, look for any product whose ingredient list contains only natural wood smoke or condensed smoke flavor with no additional components. If the label lists more than 2 ingredients, put it back. The second thing you need is water. Not tap water if you can avoid it. Chlorinated municipal water contains compounds that can interfere with the delicate biochemical signaling you are trying to facilitate. Rainwater is ideal. Filtered water works well. If tap water is your only option, fill a container and let it sit uncovered for 24 hours before use, which allows most of the chlorine to off-gas naturally. The third thing you need is a small container. A glass jar, a ceramic bowl, anything non-reactive. Avoid plastic containers where possible, as some plastic compounds can leach into solution over extended soaking periods and introduce variables you don't want. Now the ratio. For liquid smoke specifically, remembering that this is already a concentrated solution, not raw smoke water, the working dilution is 3 to 5 drops per 250 milliliters of water. Start at 3 drops if you are working with particularly sensitive species or if your liquid smoke brand is darker and more concentrated in appearance. Move to 4 or 5 drops for harder-coated seeds that have historically shown very low germination rates. Do not exceed 5 drops per 250 milliliters under any circumstances. The relationship between Caracan concentration and germination response is not linear. It peaks within a specific window and then drops sharply as inhibitory compounds in the smoke solution begin to dominate. More is not better. More is worse. The water temperature should be between 25 and 30 degrees Celsius, warm to the touch but not hot. Above 35 degrees, you risk denaturing the proteins involved in the KAI2 receptor cascade before the Caracan signal can fully activate them. Below 20 degrees, the metabolic processes that Caracans are trying to initiate slow down to the point where the treatment loses much of its effectiveness. Room temperature water on a warm day, or water gently warmed in a kettle and allowed to cool for several minutes, will fall in the right range. Add your drops, stir gently, and add your seeds. The container goes somewhere dark, a cupboard, a drawer, a box, because light exposure during the soaking phase can trigger conflicting photoreceptor signals in some species that interfere with the Caracan response. Leave them for 12 to 24 hours. 12 hours is sufficient for most species with moderately hard seed coats. 24 hours is appropriate for seeds with very hard, thick coats, Grevillea, Banksia, certain acacia species, where the Caracan solution needs more time to fully penetrate and reach the embryo. After the soak, remove the seeds and rinse them gently under clean water. This step is important. You want to remove residual smoke compounds from the seed surface before planting because as the seed begins active germination and root emergence, high surface concentrations of smoke compounds can inhibit root tip development. A gentle 30-second rinse under cool filtered water is sufficient. Do not scrub or aggressively wash the seeds. You are removing surface residue, not stripping the Caracan signal, which by this point has already done its work at the receptor level inside the seed. Plant immediately after rinsing. Do not allow treated seeds to dry out and sit for extended periods before planting. Once the Caracan signal has deactivated the ABA lock and initiated the gibberellin cascade, the germination process is underway at the cellular level whether you can see it or not. Leaving a triggered seed to desiccate is like starting a car engine and then removing the fuel line. The process has begun. It needs to be seen through. The species that respond most dramatically to this treatment share a common ecological history. They come from fire-adapted landscapes, they have hard or chemically protected seed coats, and they have historically shown frustrating, erratic germination under standard conditions. Grevillea species, across virtually the entire genus, show profound keratin sensitivity. Germination rates in research trials have moved from below 10% in untreated controls to above 65% with smoke water treatment. Banksia, another iconic Australian genus, shows similar responses, with the added benefit that keratin treatment also improves germination synchrony. Instead of a slow trickle of seedlings appearing over 6 to 8 weeks, treated seeds tend to germinate within a tight 5 to 10 day window. Protea species from the South African fynbos, which share the same fire-adapted evolutionary history as Australian natives, respond strongly. Among Mediterranean species, certain cistus varieties, Lavandula stoicus, and several native salvia species have shown measurable keratin sensitivity in horticultural trials. Beyond these established responders, there is a broader category worth experimenting with. Any seed that you have consistently failed to germinate under standard conditions, that comes from a dry or fire-prone native habitat, and that has a notably hard or thick seed coat. The hard coat itself is often a signal. It is part of the same evolutionary package as keratin sensitivity, a physical barrier designed to complement the chemical lock. If a seed has been engineered by evolution to be hard to open, there is a reasonable probability that keratins are part of the system designed to open it. For seeds outside these categories, standard vegetable crops, annual flowers bred through extensive agricultural selection, common herbs like basil, parsley, or cilantro, manage your expectations. These species have largely lost functional keratin sensitivity through generations of domestication and selective breeding that occurred entirely outside fire-adapted ecosystems. Treating them with liquid smoke solution is unlikely to cause harm at the correct dilution, but equally unlikely to produce the dramatic germination responses you will see in fire-adapted natives. The tool is precise. Use it where it was designed to work. The total cost of everything described in this section, the liquid smoke, the filtered water, the glass jar, is under $5 for a supply that will last you several hundred individual seed treatments. The commercial equivalent at current horticultural retail pricing would cost you somewhere between $150 and $200 for the same number of treatments. That gap, $5 versus $200, is not a gap in effectiveness. It is a gap in information, and that gap has existed for exactly as long as it has taken someone to sit down and explain what Flammati's paper actually means for the person standing in a garden with a packet of seeds and a persistent, nagging feeling that something is being withheld. Something was being withheld. Now it isn't. Here is something that Flammati's 2004 paper set in motion that almost nobody outside of plant molecular biology has heard about. And it matters because it reframes keratins from a gardening trick into something with implications that reach far beyond your seed tray. When the KAI2 receptor was fully mapped in 2013 by a team at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in California, the scientific community recognized almost immediately that they were looking at something unusual. KAI2 is ancient, extraordinarily ancient. It appears not just in flowering plants, not just in seed-bearing plants, but across the entire land plant lineage, in mosses, in liverworts, in ferns, in species that predate the evolution of seeds by hundreds of millions of years. Plants that have never in their evolutionary history encountered fire, that live in environments where smoke is essentially a foreign substance, still carry functional KAI2 receptors, which means keratins are not simply triggering a fire detection system, they are activating something older and more fundamental than fire itself. The current leading hypothesis in plant molecular biology is that KAI2 originally evolved to detect a different signal entirely, a class of plant hormones called strigolactones, which regulate root architecture, shoot branching, and the formation of symbiotic relationships between plant roots and soil fungi. Carrageenans, it appears, are molecularly similar enough to certain strigolactone compounds that KAI2 receptors cannot fully distinguish between them. Fire in this reading did not create the Carrageen sensitivity system. Fire accidentally hijacked a receptor that already existed for a completely different purpose. And plant species in fire-prone environments then evolved to exploit that hijacking as a reliable germination cue. This matters for a practical reason that goes well beyond seed germination. If Carrageenans are activating a receptor system that is fundamentally involved in root development and fungal symbiosis, then the effects of smoke water treatment may not end at germination. A series of studies published between 2010 and 2020 in journals including Plant and Cell Physiology and New Phytologist have documented Carrageen effects on seedling root architecture. Specifically, increases in lateral root density and root hair development in Carrageen-treated seedlings compared to untreated controls. More lateral roots means more surface area for water and nutrient uptake. More root hairs means more contact points for mycorrhizal fungi, the underground fungal networks that are now understood to be among the most important factors in long-term plant health and soil ecosystem function. In practical terms, what some of this research suggests is that Carrageen treatment may not simply wake a seed up faster. It may also set the seedling up with a more robust root system in the critical first weeks after germination, the window when a young plant is most vulnerable, and when the quality of root development has the longest downstream consequences for overall plant vigor. It is worth being careful here. Much of this research has been conducted under controlled laboratory conditions with purified carrageenolide, not liquid smoke solution. The effects observed in root architecture studies have not all been replicated consistently across species, and the field is still young enough that drawing firm practical conclusions requires some caution. What can be said honestly is that the evidence points toward Carrageen effects that extend beyond the germination event itself, and that the molecular machinery being activated is deeply integrated into fundamental plant developmental processes rather than being a narrow specialized fire response pathway. This is precisely why, from 2015 onward, the interest in Carrageenans has expanded well beyond horticultural niche research into mainstream agricultural science. The International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, CIMMYT, has investigated Carrageen application in dryland cereal crops as a potential tool for improving germination, uniformity, and early seedling establishment in water-stressed environments. Research groups in Spain and Morocco have tested smoke water application in reforestation programs targeting degraded Mediterranean landscapes, looking at whether Carrageen treatment can improve the survival rates of native tree seedlings planted in harsh, dry conditions. In California, following the catastrophic fire seasons of the late 2010s, restoration ecologists have incorporated smoke water treatment into protocols for reestablishing native plant communities in burned areas, using the chemical signal of fire itself to help fire-adapted species reclaim landscapes that fire has cleared. And in South Africa, researchers working with the extraordinarily biodiverse fynbos ecosystem, a shrubland biome that contains more plant species per square kilometer than the Amazon rainforest, and that is almost entirely dependent on fire for regeneration, have used Carrageen research to develop large-scale seed bank restoration protocols. Seeds that had been collected and stored for conservation purposes but had shown near zero germination rates under standard conditions were successfully germinated at scale using smoke water treatment, allowing species that had been functionally absent from restoration plantings for decades to re-enter conservation programs. The scale of what is being accomplished with this knowledge in professional restoration and agricultural research contexts makes the price markup on commercial seed treatment products even harder to justify. The same scientific understanding that is being applied in CIMMYT dryland programs and South African fynbos conservation efforts is available to every home gardener who understands what Carrageenans are and where to find them. The $47 billion seed industry did not develop this knowledge. Publicly funded universities developed it. The people who translated it into commercial products added packaging and a pricing structure. Neither of those contributions changes what the molecule does when it contacts a KAI2 receptor in a dormant seed. What is genuinely new, what the last decade of research has added beyond Flammati's original discovery, is the understanding that you are not simply using a germination hack when you use smoke water treatment. You are engaging with one of the oldest and most conserved signaling systems in plant biology. You are reaching back past the evolution of flowering plants, past the evolution of seeds themselves, into a molecular conversation that land plants have been having with their chemical environment for over 400 million years. And you are doing it with a $3 bottle from the condiment aisle. That is not a trick. That is applied science. And the fact that it requires a video like this one to connect those dots, rather than appearing on the label of every packet of hard-coated native seeds sold in every garden center on Earth, tells you everything you need to know about whose interests the current information landscape is designed to serve. It was not designed to serve yours. But here is what no patent filing and no information asymmetry can change. The science is public, the mechanism is understood, and the tool is accessible. The question is no longer whether you can do this. The question is what you are going to grow.